Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 595 of the People Behind the Science podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are excited to be rebroadcasting our interview with Dr. Peter Crane, originally published on September 21st, 2015. Listeners, Peter is a renowned botanist and author who has made important contributions to our understanding of the origin and early evolution of flowering plants by studying the fossil record of plants. He has received numerous national and international honors and awards for his research conducted in a variety of prestigious positions spanning the UK and the United States. During our interview, listeners, Peter shares some great stories and insights. So get ready to hear more from Peter in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. I am joined today by Sir Peter Crane. And Peter, we are excited to welcome you to the show today. How are you?
Very good, Marie. Thank you so much. I hope things are good with you too.
Things are quite well, and I am looking forward to our conversation today. But before we dive into the details, I want to give our listeners just a little bit of information about you. So listeners, Peter is the Carl W. Knobloch Jr. Dean of the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and Professor of Botany at Yale University. He received his bachelor's and Ph.D. in Botany from the University of Reading in the United Kingdom. Afterward, Peter conducted postdoctoral research at Indiana University, and he worked for about 17 years at the Field Museum in Chicago, rising from Assistant Curator in Paleobotany to Museum Director. Peter then served as Director and Chief Executive of the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. He also served as the John and Marion Sullivan University Professor at the University of Chicago before joining the faculty at Yale, where he is today. Now, Peter has received many prestigious awards and honors during his career. First and foremost, he was knighted in the United Kingdom in 2004 for his contributions to horticulture and conservation. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society, a Foreign Associate of the National Academy of Sciences, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in addition, Peter has received multiple honorary degrees and fellowships, including an honorary doctoral degree from the University of Cambridge. Peter was also the recipient of the International Prize for Biology, awarded in Japan last December, as well as many other national and international awards. And listeners, today, Peter is here with us to share his experiences in life and science. So Peter, we are so excited to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us, what do you like to do with your time when you're not doing science?
Obviously, I do a lot of administration these days, and have done for the last 25 years or so, and that's cut down on the amount of time I have to devote to science and the amount of time I have to devote to other things. But in terms of other activities, I love to travel, and it's often possible to merge that travel with my research and other professional responsibilities. I love to be outside, and sometimes it's possible to merge that with the opportunity to do some field work. And when I'm not doing that, I love to read biographies. I really enjoy reading about people living and in the past and what they've got to teach us about how we might conduct ourselves. So I enjoy a bit of reading as well.
Well, it sounds like you have quite a bit on your plate to keep you busy. And I know on our show, we love to talk about books. So I love getting book recommendations from everyone we have on our program. So Peter, can you tell us about a book that you've read and really enjoyed that we should add to our list?
I don't get much time for reading, but over the summer I found a bit more time. And so I read over the summer David Axelrod's biography, Believer, in which he talks about the kind of inside story of Barack Obama's campaign. And that was particularly interesting to me because David Axelrod is from Chicago, and so he also recounts as part of that many of the things that I remember taking place in Chicago for all those years that I was there. And then I read another great book, a fictional book, which is not something I often do, but The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet by David Mitchell, which is a kind of historical novel set in the Dutch East India Company base of Deshima in southern Japan at the end of the 18th century. And that was a wonderful, wonderful story with a lot of history, but also beautifully, beautifully written.
Well, those are excellent recommendations, Peter. I'll put those out on our website for our listeners to find. And I understand you are an author yourself. You've written the book, Ginkgo, The Tree That Time Forgot. So can you tell us a little bit about your book?
That was a kind of a personal challenge to me to see if I could write something that was not quite so technically dense as what I'm usually writing and something that would be interesting to a broader audience. And it was really an opportunity to talk about a remarkable plant, but also I think of it as an evolutionary and cultural biography of this incredible tree over the last 200 million years. First, its origin and its spread across the planet, and then its gradual demise and near extinction, but then its reprise and revival at the hands of people over the last 1,000 years or so, and its eventual spread from China and Japan and Korea to the West, and now it's a very popular street tree, one of the most common street trees in Manhattan and planted in cities all over the world. So it's really a kind of life story of this tree, but over a couple of 100 million years. And it was huge fun to write, but more effort than I would have predicted when I started the project.
Gotcha. Well, Peter, we will add this to our book list as well. And now I want to take the high-level view of your work. So can you give us a big picture look into how you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with science?
Well, most of my scientific work has been based on looking at fossil plants. And really the interest in looking at those fossil plants for me has really been in what they tell us about plant evolution. So in a sense, they are the physical evidence of plant evolution over the last 450 million years. So that's really what I've focused on in my career. And within that broad topic, I've really focused on a time about 130, 100 million years ago when the plants that dominate our planet today, flowering plants, were just evolving and just getting started. And so much of the work that I've done with my wonderful collaborators has been to look at the early evolution of flowers and the early evolution of flowering plants. It's been an interesting journey, and it's involved me not only in studying the fossils, but also in spending a lot of time comparing them with living plants and trying to understand the living plants to which they're most closely related. So I've had a lot of fun with that over the last 35 years or so, and I think we've made some great progress and some discoveries that perhaps wouldn't have been expected, but there's always so much more to do.
Certainly. I think the to-do list is never ending for most scientists. So I look forward to chatting more about your research as we go through the interview. But let's talk about motivation for a moment. Like you said, there's so much to get done in a day, particularly with your administrative responsibilities as dean. Do you have a particular favorite saying or quote that you keep in your mind to get through the tough times?
I always say to people that you have to remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint, and so you have to kind of pace yourself. You just have to stick at it. But I also think that humility is a wonderful thing in science, and any scientist who tells you that they have the complete truth on anything is probably not thinking too carefully. So my view of science, it's a quote that comes from, I think, a philosopher of science some time ago, is, I view science as successive approximations to the truth. And you know you're never quite going to get to the full truth, but you hope that you can kind of get some way down the road. And I think that's a good way to think about science. And it brings in a certain amount of humility, but it also is encouraging in the sense that you actually can make some progress.
Absolutely. Well, I think that is a fantastic quote. And I liked applying this idea of successive approximations. And I think as technology keeps improving, we do keep getting closer and closer. Well, great to hear about what motivates you and what keeps you going during those darker days, Peter. But I want to talk next about some of the people who may have helped you along your journey. So can you tell us a little bit about some of these people who you've looked up to, perhaps as role models or mentors?
I think, again, anyone who reflects on it for more than a moment must surely understand that so many people have been important influences in their lives, and it's certainly no different for me. Wonderful high school teachers that I had, Tony Simmons and John Steen back in the UK, to the wonderful advisors that I had during my time at the University of Reading, Peter Barnard and Tom Harris and Vernon Hayward, and the mentors that I've had through my career like Bill Challoner, and then many friends and colleagues who I've worked together collaboratively with over the years, and they've contributed so much to my own development as a scientist. And all of those people have contributed in different ways, but cumulatively their impact has done a lot to produce whatever success I've had. So you can't be anything than thoroughly grateful for all of those interactions over a long period of time.
Well, wonderful to hear about some of the people who have shaped you as a scientist and as a person. I think you're absolutely right. The sum of all the mentorship that you've received over the years that helps you get to where you are today.
Absolutely.
So wonderful to hear about these people who've had a big impact on you. But I want to take us back to the beginning, Peter. Can you tell us, have you always had this love of plants, or can you remember when it first started?
I think plants were always sort of around, part of my life. I grew up spending a lot of time outdoors, so they were always there. But I think my real interest in them was stimulated in high school by those mentors, Tony Simmons and John Steen, in different ways. One, the opportunity to get outside and see plants in the field, and two, the opportunity to think about plants in archaeological as opposed to sort of geological contexts. That really then led to a sort of developing academic interest at the university level. And then it just developed really from there.
Certainly. So can you tell us, you've had quite a few interesting positions over the course of your career. Can we start with your time at the Field Museum and tell us a little bit about how you got that position and what kept you there for 17 years?
I was tremendously fortunate to go to the Field Museum and to have some wonderful mentors there, including the former president of the museum, Sandy Boyd. So I arrived in Chicago in 1982, and at that point, following from my postdoc at Indiana University, I was applying for jobs wherever I could apply for. I applied.
Mm-hmm. This will resonate with a lot of students out there now. Yeah.
Well, nothing's changed. The first one I got was in Chicago. So I showed up in Chicago in the fall of 1982 and really sort of started my work as a kind of research scientist and as a curator of the wonderful collections there at the Field Museum. And certainly for the first decade, I really didn't do much else other than my research, help with the museum's public programs, and curate the collections. But slowly, I ended up taking on more administrative responsibilities. I found that I could do those while also keeping up my research, and that really sort of set trend for the future. But the Field Museum was a fabulous, fabulous experience. I was so fortunate to get that position, and the people there were supportive, and I had tremendous opportunities. So I'm always grateful to the Field Museum. I'm always grateful to those people in the city of Chicago for all those opportunities, which, looking back on, were just remarkable.
Certainly. I know I visited the museum myself, as I'm sure many of our listeners have as well. It is a phenomenal place. But then after your time at the Field Museum, you then moved on to the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what brought you there?
Growing up in the UK, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew is sort of embedded in the national consciousness. I mean, it's one of the most well-known gardens in the world, and certainly the most well-known garden in the UK. And I was lucky enough to be a vacation student at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in 1974 when I was at the University of Reading. So I spent a summer at Kew and absolutely fell in love with the place. So anxious to leave Chicago. I loved the Field Museum, but the experiences that I'd got there gave me the opportunity to take on this leadership role at Kew, which was really a dream job. While I was there, we secured World Heritage Site status for the gardens. We did a lot of things to improve the facilities for science and the collections, and we did a lot to get the public side of the garden a little more well known. So it was a fantastic experience and gave us the opportunity to meet all kinds of incredible people who came through the gardens. Yeah, it was a real highlight in our career. So my family and I really enjoyed our time at Kew. It's a magnificent, magnificent place with a wonderful 18th century landscape with a 19th century landscape over the top, and a lot of history, particularly about plants, but also about people. Really the world center for studying the variety of plant life on the planet. So it was tremendously stimulating from a scientific point of view, too.
Well, it sounds like a lovely place, Peter. Can you tell us then, what was it that brought you back to academic science and away from this wonderful, picturesque place?
Well, I think part of it was the attraction to continue to keep doing my science. The Kew job was a pretty big job and a fairly high-profile public job, and it was tough to kind of keep going on the scientific side. So after a while, I felt like if I didn't get back to my research before long, that I'd probably lose touch with it completely. And once you lose touch, it's very difficult to get back. There are obvious attractions in going back to Chicago for family, but also because I'd simply been there for so long. So I took the opportunity to spend time at the University of Chicago, which was fabulous. But then after a while, I also felt that I probably should take on another leadership role, and was fortunate enough to be appointed to this incredible school here at Yale.
Well, thank you for walking us through your career path, sort of the Cliff Notes version there, Peter. I like it. So can you tell us now that you're at Yale University, what is one of the projects that you have ongoing at the moment that you are just the most excited about?
Well, on the science side, I absolutely am excited about a current project we have looking at fossil plants from Mongolia. I was in Mongolia with my collaborators, both from Mongolia and the U.S., back in late June, early July. And the attraction of that material we've been collecting there is just the exceptional quality of the preservation. This material is about 130 million years old, or perhaps 120 million years old.
Oh, wow.
And it looks like it's just come out fresh from the compost heap. It hasn't been altered. It's been compressed and partly codified, but it's in really excellent condition, and that allows us to compare those ancient fossils with their living relatives. So that's what we're really engaged in at the moment. It's a slow business, but we already have identified a range of very interesting early conifers and some other very interesting seed plants that are not evidently closely related to any modern groups. We're still figuring out that puzzle. The opportunity to collect that material has been great. And so that's the thing that I'm most excited about at the moment, is pursuing that work on those Mongolian fossils.
So do those Mongolian fossils closely resemble anything that's currently existent in Mongolia today?
No, they don't really. Among them are some familiar things like ginkgo. Ginkgo is there. And there are some plants that are similar to certain groups of modern conifers. A living conifer called Cunninghania that grows in China. A fossil relative of that group is present in the Mongolian material. There are some early relatives of pines there too. But some of the plants are so strange, it's hard to know what they're related to in terms of their closest living counterparts. And that's kind of the puzzle that we're trying to figure out.
Well, that's very interesting. I know a lot of people, including myself, are fascinated by being able to, in our own minds, recreate what the past looked like. So looking at some of these fossil plants and thinking about what today might be most resembling them is really fascinating. So very exciting to hear more about your work. And I think so far we've talked about a lot of the exciting aspects of your career and about the career of a scientist, but we haven't yet touched on some of the troubles and some of the struggles. And I think, Peter, every scientist has these periods in their career where they were going through a challenge or they had a major failure and they had to figure out how to get through it. So to help our listeners out there who might be aspiring scientists themselves, can you tell them about one of your own struggles or challenges and how you worked your way through it to be so successful?
I think you certainly run into these periods where you feel like you're not making any progress. And sometimes you run into periods where you feel like you're going in the wrong direction completely. That's happened several times in the course of my career. And sometimes it's a sort of self-inflicted problem. You attempt to do something a bit audacious and a bit ambitious. And then when you get into it, you kind of get bogged down. And perhaps you've got a deadline to write that particular paper or something, and the pressure starts to build. Certainly, in the early days, I took on the task of trying to do a big synthesis of seed plant relationships, taking into account not only our living seed plants, but also the fossil ones. And there were times when I thought I would never finish that. And similarly, with a book that we produced just a few years ago, there were times when I thought we would never finish it. But you keep plugging away at it, you eventually get through it. So I think part of the business about being a scientist is just that sort of tenacity to kind of keep at it. It can sometimes be sort of daunting. I well understand people who walk away from certain problems. It's a lot of effort sometimes to get through these kind of fallow periods.
Certainly. So has there ever been a project that you can remember, Peter, that you had to just walk away from because you were not making progress on it?
Well, I think there have been projects that we've written up, but they've been sort of rather unsatisfactory. I mean, we've taken it as far as we could go, but we knew that we still hadn't quite got to the bottom of it. I mean, I can think of some fossils we studied years ago where we had enormously complete information, and we did our best in trying to understand what these plants were related to in terms of the modern flora. And we took our best stab at it and published it. But at the end of the day, it wasn't very satisfactory because one really felt that you still haven't really cracked that problem. And then in other cases, you work on a project and you just feel intuitively you've got the right answer. Everything falls into place. It's very clear. Mm-hmm. And you ask yourself afterwards, why didn't I think of that before?
Right.
So you have both sides of it. I think as you go through your career, you inevitably come across both of those things. And some of them you just have to do your best with and lay it out and hope that somebody else smarter or with better material will come along and improve on what you've got.
Well, thank you for sharing some of these challenges that you've faced, Peter. And I think it is helpful to get some of these challenges out in the open to talk about them, because I think scientists often don't talk about these failures, these challenges, these struggles that they've had in their career. But we don't just want to focus on your difficult times, Peter. I want to talk about success next. So can you share one of your own success stories with us today? And it can be a small victory or one of these large victories.
Well, I think in a way it's the sort of small victories. When I was a postdoc, we started to study some fossils from about 100 million years ago. And starting out, it wasn't clear what these things were. And we had various little pieces of the plant. But over time, we were able to kind of put those pieces together. And once we put it together, it was pretty clear that we'd got the right answer. that this ancient plant was very closely related to modern magnolias and tulip trees, and all the evidence just sort of fell beautifully into place. And I think those are kind of very satisfying situations. But as I said a moment ago, you have the opposite, where you sometimes struggle with these things. I feel like I've had a mixture of these in my career. Perhaps one of the biggest successes has been that we have actually been able to find really well-preserved material where other people perhaps would not have looked for that material. And just the nature of the preservation and the way that we've been able to study it has meant that we've got a whole new source of paleobotanical fossil plant information from areas and about things that we probably never dreamed that we would have. Certainly when I was a student, if I'd have asked someone to have a bet on whether we would find some of these things, everybody would have been happy to take it because no one would imagine that we could have found such things.
Sure. Well, I think thinking about plants specifically and thinking about how anything could remain after 130 million years is incredible. So can you describe a little bit, what are the ideal conditions or the ideal places that you would look for these well-preserved specimens?
The material that we've worked on with my colleague Elsa Marie Fries and also Kai Pedersen have been really tiny little angiosperm flowers, little flowers of flowering plants. And although they're tiny, they might only be a millimeter or two big. Studied in the right way, they're very, very informative. So we've been able to describe a whole range of flowers from this time between about 100 and 125 million years ago, where people simply thought they would never be preserved. And often they're preserved in a very curious way. Sometimes they're preserved just by being deposited in an environment where decomposition is minimized, but sometimes they're preserved rather dramatically by having been burnt in a forest fire. So many of the fossils that we collect are actually charcoalified, so they're exquisitely preserved as charcoal. Can be studied in great detail, and they're basically the remains of 100-million-year-old forest fire that went through and burnt the forest and in the process charred some of these beautiful little flowers that we can still study today. And pursuing that line of research has been very important in my career and has yielded a wealth of information where people thought that information would never be available.
Well, this is fascinating and great to hear a little bit more about your work and where you might find these tiny fossils that have survived so many years. I know we mentioned in our introduction that you were knighted for your contributions to science. So can you tell us a little bit about this big success and what the experience was like?
That was a tremendous experience. It's hard to know exactly what that award was for, but I think it was probably a combination of the science and also the leadership at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. And of course, it's tremendous to get that notice and then to kind of go to the palace and to go to the official ceremony, which is absolutely one of the great highlights of my life and our family's life together. So, yeah, it was an extraordinary day. We just were thrilled by the whole occasion. To be there as well with so many other people who'd done so much, and often cases much more in terms of public service, was just a real thrill. And I think the honours system in the UK is a great way to recognize not just what a lot of prominent people do, but what a lot of ordinary people do and how much they contribute to society on a daily basis. I think it's just terrific.
Well, this is a phenomenal accomplishment and congratulations again on that success. But can you remember where you were when you first found out?
I got a letter.
Really? A snail mail letter?
I got a snail mail letter. I opened it and I called my wife up and I said, "You'd better come over here and read this letter." Wow. Just to make sure it's true. And at that point, it was still confidential, and one had to respond to the letter, and then a few weeks later, the official announcement appeared in the newspaper. I remember exactly where I was sitting when I got that letter. It was quite a surprise out of the blue.
Well, that is phenomenal. Thank you for sharing a little bit about this experience and congratulations again. And I know we've talked a little bit about how you've traveled to different places throughout your career, but I want to hear next, Peter, about one of these places that you've been to that you would just consider your favorite place that you've been for science.
Oh, gosh, there are so many places. I mean, one of the great things about being interested in the variety of plant life is that everywhere you go in the world, there are always interesting plants to see. That's the same in North America, that's the same in Europe. But the tropics is a wonderful place to go for plants. Years ago, I spent a summer in Trinidad with a wonderful botanist called Dennis Adams. I spent 6 weeks with him, and I learned a lot of tropical plants. But I think one of the most memorable trips we've had with my family is to Borneo. Wonderful plants and, of course, wonderful animals too, orangutans and proboscis monkeys and all sorts of interesting things, but also the giant Rafflesia flower and some huge tropical trees, pitcher plants, insectivorous pitcher plants, all sorts of interesting things. So Borneo, for a biologist, and particularly for a plant biologist, is really, really fascinating. There's so much to see. But the tropics in general, even other places like the tip of southern Africa, is so rich in amazing flowering plants that it's just a dream for someone with an interest in botany.
So, Peter, I must ask, do you have a sort of plant bucket list of things that you want to see in your lifetime?
Actually, I do. And I've been lucky enough to see a lot of them, but there are some that I haven't seen yet. I'd love to see the bristlecone pines in Nevada and California, up in the White Mountains. I'd love to see the cobra lily in Northern California. So I still got a lot on my list. I just saw back in January for the first time the giant Amazonian water lily, which we used to grow at Kew and is grown in many botanic gardens. But to see it in the wild is really a pretty special thing. So, yeah, I have been ticking off a few things on the bucket list, but I've still got a few more to go.
Gotcha. And now, do you have a favorite plant, either aesthetically or scientifically, that you really enjoy the most?
That's hard. I mean, people would probably say, well, what about ginkgo?
Right.
That is a totally fascinating plant. But I think every plant has that story if you look deeply enough. Every plant has an evolutionary history. Many plants have a history that's intimately connected with people over the past few million years. So the ginkgo is a kind of classic example, but just about every plant that you could think of has an interesting evolutionary history, but also a kind of cultural side as it's existed over the last several million years, but particularly over the last few thousand years in association with people. And some plants have not done very well out of that, and other plants have thrived in the habitats that people have created. But most plants have both this evolutionary history and this kind of cultural history. Sometimes it's very direct. We use those plants for particular purposes. Sometimes it's indirect. Those plants flourish or don't flourish in the habitats that we create. But most plants have this dual component to their history. And I think that's what fascinates me about these plants. They all have a story. It enhances the joy that you feel in the world if you know just even a little bit about those stories.
Definitely. And I think knowing the science of some of these plants is interesting, even if you're coming across them in, for example, history or literature, things like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, wonderful to hear more about the plants that are near and dear to your heart, Peter. And we've talked a little bit about your life as a scientist. And I think scientists are often portrayed as a certain way in the media, often as being very serious and critical. And I know scientists are very serious about the work that they do because it is so important. But scientists like to have fun as well. And science is conducted by people. So we love to focus on the human side of science and share some of these fun stories and fun memories that scientists have shared together. And I think one of the things that happens at a lot of the different institutions and laboratories and places you might have worked over the years is a lot of fun traditions develop where you just share some funny memories together. So, Peter, can you share with us today one of these memories of yours?
I think that these generally revolve around people and the wonderful fun that comes with interacting with people, either working collaboratively together on a project or sometimes taking a situation and seeing it in a very different way. My collaborators have just had a huge amount of fun, and the delight at some of the discoveries of things that we found has just been terrific to be able to share with other people. But I think also, any big project can be daunting, but it can be very, very stimulating. One of the experiences I had at the Field Museum, which is not really a scientific problem so much, or at least it didn't start as a scientific issue, was really to do with a large Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton.
I like the way this is going so far.
Which was offered for sale at Sotheby's, and the Field Museum decided to make a bid on it. And we bid on it, and we secured it for a very large sum of money. So it was tremendously exhilarating, but then we were faced with the problem of what to do with it.
Right.
We actually had to set up a very complicated operation to prepare these fossils and mount the bones as a public exhibit. But along the way, we also had the opportunity to employ a scientist to do a really detailed study of T-Rex. So that involved, for example, packaging up the skull and taking it to a huge CT machine and having the skull scanned so that we could see what the brain of T-Rex looked like and so on and so forth. That was just a tremendous project with a huge number of emotional ups and downs in the whole thing. That's got to be one of the sort of highlights of my career, and there were many, many people involved in it. But if you go to Chicago today, you can see in the main hall there in Stanley Field Hall this magnificent T-Rex, given the nickname of Sue. And it's great to think that I had just a little bit to do with that. Me and my colleagues had a huge amount of fun with that project.
That sounds like a fantastic memory. So were you there at the auction when you guys won this T-Rex?
I was there at the auction, and it was a kind of a tense experience. You don't know who you were bidding against. We were also bidding on the phone, so people didn't know we were there either. So to be left standing bidder on this amazing thing, and then to go down, because everyone was interested to know who had bought this incredible skeleton.
Sure. Then
to go down and do a little press conference, and it's the only time I've been on the front page of the New York Times, and I hope it probably will only be the other time that I'm on the front page. It was an extraordinary experience.
Well, that sounds like so much fun. And one of these great opportunities that, like you said, you wouldn't necessarily have normally in a scientific context outside of some place like the Field Museum. So,
right. And what I love about it, too, is that it's almost related to my research. So T-Rex was running around on the landscape 70 million years ago, and some of the fossil plants that we've been studying at that age. And, of course, one of the fossil plants that's very well known from that age is ginkgo itself. So I like to say T-Rex knew ginkgo too.
Right.
So did all of his other dinosaur friends. So it's amazing to think that that tree that we take for granted lived in such a very different world with these bizarre animals. It's something that's very interesting to reflect on.
Certainly, and that tree survived over those millions of years, whereas the T-Rex couldn't manage it, certainly.
Whatever killed off the T-Rex, ginkgo didn't seem to be bothered by it.
Right. Well, great to talk more about your experiences in science. And I know you've had an opportunity to answer many interesting questions over the years, but I want to learn next about the questions that you have not yet been able to answer, Peter. So can you tell us if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility were not a problem, you had no barriers, what is the one question that you would still want to answer?
Well, I think going back to the sort of ups and downs of a scientific career, I mean, one of the most highly cited papers that I wrote was this paper back in 1985, which really tried to synthesize all of the evidence from living and fossil plants into an understanding of the way the different groups of seed plants are interrelated. There are only 5 groups of living seed plants. Ginkgo is one of them. And the question is, how do they relate to each other, and how do they relate to all of the various groups of seed plants that are extinct? And what does that tell us about particularly the origin of flowering plants? I worked on this problem back in the mid-1980s, and the work that was done subsequently pretty much confirmed the results that I'd come up with. But again, I felt like we didn't have a full understanding of the situation. So I wasn't completely confident in the results. Then the molecular analyses started to appear around about the year 2000, and they started to produce very different results. Of course, they can't look at the fossils, but they can look at the 5 living groups, and the pattern from the 5 living groups was not the same as the pattern that we determined based on putting the living and the fossil groups together. And that's sort of really where we stand now. That's sort of an impasse. We have evidence from the molecules based just on the living plants, which points in a couple of different directions, that in itself is not entirely reliable. We have evidence from putting the living and the fossil plants together, which points in different directions, and itself is not entirely convincing. I would love to get to the bottom of this mystery. And,
certainly.
I do think there are some kind of glimmers of a way to reconcile these 2 different points of view, where each of them is partly right, but partly wrong. If I could wave a magic wand and have a resolution of that problem, I would be very, very happy. I think that this is one problem that I'm probably not going to be around to see get solved. But I still hope we can make a little bit of progress on it in the few years of my remaining career. But it's a tough one, and we're not there yet. So I'd love to see it solved.
Certainly. So, Peter, do you think there are a few maybe key missing link types of specimens that are out there waiting to be discovered? Or is this more of an organization and figuring out with the data that you have what the pattern is?
I think that there are many things out there still to be discovered. I think that's clear. But I also think that even the evidence that we have, we don't yet understand properly. And it's often the case in science that we look at a set of data in one way and we overlook that it could be interpreted in a very different way. I think the next step in this problem is a sort of little mini paradigm shift that would change the way we look at the whole problem. Some assumptions that we're making that aren't right, and finding those assumptions and overturning them and seeing the thing in a different way, I think will take us a bit closer to a more sensible solution.
Certainly. Sometimes you have to take the puzzle apart to get the pieces to fit back together the right way.
I think that's right.
So wonderful to hear about this big question that's on your mind. And I know over the course of your career, we talked about some of the people who had a big impact on you. And I want you to share with us today what you would consider perhaps one of these best pieces of advice that you've received over the course of your career from someone.
One of the things that I do say to my students and that was said to me was there's great enjoyment in being able to do different things. They often say a change is as good as a rest, and the opportunity to stimulate yourself by taking on different problems, whether that's in science or whether that's in administration or a combination of the two, I think is good advice and keeps you lively and keeps you moving forward. Part of that, too, is kind of keeping one's options open, being open to new possibilities, being open to new ways of looking at things, being open to new career opportunities, maybe. And in research, that's about keeping your research going, but also looking for kind of new ways to enliven that research, new techniques, new approaches, new ideas that keeps you on your toes. And of course, one of the great ways to do that is to be around students. They always ask hard questions. Part of being a scientist is to be stimulated by new questions, new approaches, new techniques, and being open to them rather than just sticking with the safe pattern of what you know.
Absolutely. You definitely have to be changing as the times are changing and adapting and moving along all these different directions that your research might be taking you. So wonderful advice, Peter. Is there any other last piece of advice or a last note of inspiration that you want to end our interview on today?
I just think science is huge fun. And if you really love your science, it's a great way to spend your career. It's sometimes not easy or straightforward, and sometimes it can be blended with these administrative jobs, but it's enormously stimulating to me and has been since the very beginning to think that you can actually discover new things about the world, things that no one ever knew before. And I think that's what keeps a lot of scientists going. It's certainly something that's kept me going. So that opportunity to think that despite the fact that we've been studying the natural world now for many, many centuries, there's still a lot to learn, and you as an individual can make one of those discoveries. That's just tremendously inspiring to me. And certainly that's one of the things that I've enjoyed most.
Well, very well said, Peter. I know I agree wholeheartedly there. Science is so much fun and so exciting to be part of this discovery process. So listeners, hopefully you're as excited about science as we are. And Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell our listeners where they can go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Absolutely. They can find me on the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies website, and they can contact me through that.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely check out more about what Peter is working on. And Peter, thank you for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
Thank you, Marion. My pleasure.
Well, it was a delight to chat with you. And listeners, wonderful to have you with us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.